Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready to dive into some geopolitical dynamics today.
Always ready.
We've got a really interesting set of articles and research you sent over, mostly focused on the whole Trump's reverse Kissinger strategy.
Oh, yeah, that's a fascinating one. A lot of buzz around that lately.
What are some of the things that are jumping out at you from all this material?
Well, I think the first thing is how this is all playing out, like right in the middle of the war in Ukraine. The Trump administration is really pushing hard for these peace talks with Russia,
Right, yeah,
which is a pretty big shift from where the previous administration stood on all that.
that's true, big shift. And, a lot of people were pointing out the timing of it all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is it really about trying to get to peace, or is there something else going on strategically here?
Yeah, it's probably a little of both, to be honest. But the thing that I find really interesting is this administration's laser focus on China. They seem to see China as like the biggest challenge, even more so than like the Soviet Union back in the Cold War.
Oh, wow.
And their thinking seems to be that if they can get this Ukraine thing settled, then all that energy and all those resources can be focused on countering China.
So that's where the reverse Kissinger idea comes in.
Exactly.
Like Trump is trying to take a page out of the Nixon-Kissinger playbook.
Yeah, like trying to exploit any kind of tension between Russia and China to give the U.S. an advantage. But this is a really important point. The relationship between Russia and China right now, it's stronger than it's ever been. I mean, they're really aligned both economically and strategically.
Yeah.
Which makes this whole thing a lot more complicated than just doing what Nixon and Kissinger did back in the 70s,
Yeah, so the historical context is completely different.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes me wonder, is this administration, are they overestimating how much influence they really have over the relationship between those two countries?
It's a good question. I mean, some analysts are actually arguing that this whole approach could end up pushing the U.S. and EU further apart.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of dividing Russia and China.
Ah.
Because you've got European leaders who are already saying they want a more independent foreign policy and closer ties with China.
So it's like the opposite of what they want. Instead of isolating Russia, the U.S. ends up kind of isolating itself.
Well, yeah, that's one possible outcome for sure. And it brings up another interesting question, too. How committed is Trump to peace, really?
Right, yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have him pushing for these peace talks in Ukraine, but then on the other hand, he's made all these statements about expanding U.S. territory, even mentioning things like Greenland, the Panama Canal, even Gaza.
Oh, wow, yeah. And then there's his peace through strength thing.
Right.
To be honest, that phrase has always kind of confused me.
It's basically, if you boil it down, it's achieving peace by being so militarily dominant that nobody even thinks about challenging you. So the idea is, if you're strong enough, nobody messes with you, and then boom, you've got peace.
So it's less about diplomacy and more about just military might.
Yeah, pretty much. And this actually leads into another key thing the Trump administration is doing. Trump has been pushing NATO members to increase their defense spending, like way up to 5% of their GDP.
5%? Wow, that's more than double what they have to spend now, right?
More than double, yeah. The current requirement is just 2%.
So what's the reasoning behind that? Why such a huge increase?
Well, on the surface, it's all about making NATO stronger and scaring off any potential enemies, right? But critics say it mostly benefits U.S. military contractors. And it ties back into that whole pivot towards the Pacific, getting ready for a possible conflict with China.
Right.
It's all connected.
So it seems like that peace through strength idea, it's not really about peace so much as getting ready for a showdown with China.
Yeah, that's a big takeaway from these sources for sure. And then you see that reflected in the people who are actually shaping this strategy. Like Pete Hegseth, for instance, the current Secretary of Defense. He calls himself a crusader, has that whole neoconservative worldview.
Okay, I've heard of Hegseth.
Yeah.
But crusader seems a little intense, even for Secretary of Defense.
Well, it's not just talk. Like, he literally has crusader tattoos.
No way, seriously, crusader tattoos.
Yeah, really. And it's not just him. You've got Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, and he's another big name pushing this, really assertive foreign policy. He's known for being pro-war pretty much consistently, and for his strong anti-China views.
So we've got these guys pushing this reverse Kissinger strategy, and it seems like it's all about isolating Russia so they can take on China. But what are the chances it's actually going to work?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, From what we've been reading, it doesn't seem very likely that Russia would just ditch their partnership with China and go running to the U.S.,
Right.
especially with how the West has treated Russia in the past. And then you've got the deep economic ties between Russia and Asia. It just doesn't seem very realistic.
One of the articles even had this quote from Xi Jinping where he says that the relationship between Russia and China, like, it can't be broken.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that gets to a fundamental misunderstanding between the US and China when it comes to this idea of a multipolar world.
Okay, yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about. Multipolarity comes up a lot in the articles, but it's not always clear what it means in this context.
Well, the way China sees it, multipolarity means that all countries get equal representation, regardless of their size.
Okay.
It's about moving past colonialism and that whole core periphery structure.
Just to make sure we're all on the same page here, can you remind me what that structure is?
Sure, so it's that traditional global power model,
Mm.
where the powerful core countries, they basically exploit the resources and labor from the less developed periphery nations.
Ah, got it.
China sees multipolarity as a way to break out of that model and make the global system more fair.
Makes sense. So then how does the U.S. see multipolarity?
Well, from what I can tell from the stuff you sent me, the US seems to see it more like a 19th century competition for spheres of influence.
So they're basically using the same word, but they mean completely different things.
Exactly. And that kind of misunderstanding could be a major roadblock to getting any kind of global stability.
That's wild. Okay, so we've talked about the political and the strategic stuff, but let's get a little more down to earth here. What about the economic side of the Russia-China partnership? Like, why are they such close partners economically?
Well, one big reason is that economic integration between Russia and Asia has been growing really fast, and part of that is because of the Western sanctions. China is now Russia's biggest trading partner,
Wow.
and it's a relationship that benefits both of them.
And it's not just about trade, right? Some of the reports talked about how alternative financial systems are growing, like using local currencies and setting up these interbank messaging systems that are outside of the U.S.-dominated SWIFT system.
That's right. Russia and China are really trying to break free from depending on the US dollar and Western financial institutions.
Yeah.
It's partly a response to sanctions, but it's also strategic. They want to create a financial system that's more multipolar.
So it seems like the economic connection between Russia and China is much deeper than a lot of people in the U.S. realize.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And that's another thing that makes this whole reverse Kissinger strategy really tricky.
So basically what we're seeing is the Trump administration making a big gamble that they can break up Russia and China. But from everything we've talked about, the historical context, how strong the Russia-China relationship is, and these totally different views on multipolarity, it doesn't look like an easy bet.
Yeah, definitely not a sure thing. And it makes you wonder, what happens if it doesn't work out?
Right. What are the consequences if this gamble goes wrong? That's something we'll definitely have to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's, if this reverse Kissinger thing backfires, it could be pretty bad for the US.
Yeah. So let's say they don't manage to drive a wedge between Russia and China.
Yeah.
What happens then? What does that mean for where the U.S. stands in the world?
Well, it could actually make the Russia-China partnership even stronger.
Oh, wow.
Push them closer together because they see the U.S. putting on all this pressure.
Right.
And that would be a pretty big blow to U.S. power and influence globally.
It seems like this whole strategy is based on this idea that if China or Russia benefits, then that automatically means the U.S. loses.
Yeah, it's very much a zero-sum kind of thinking.
Right.
Like there can only be one winner in international relations.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a risky approach,
Yeah.
It could lead to all sorts of conflicts and instability that we don't need.
So if the U.S. wants to avoid getting, like, pushed aside on the world stage,
Right.
is there a different way to go about this? Like, is there an alternative to this whole Cold War mentality?
That's the big question, right? And a lot of people are wrestling with it right now.
Yeah.
I think one alternative is for the U.S. to move away from this idea that it has to be the dominant global power and start thinking about a more cooperative approach to international relations.
That would be a pretty huge change in thinking, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Especially for the people who, make U.S. foreign policy.
For sure. I mean, it would mean acknowledging that other countries have their own interests, their own goals, and that the U.S. can't just tell everyone else what to do.
Yeah.
It's about moving away from a world with just one superpower calling all the shots towards a world where power is shared more equally.
a truly multipolar world.
Exactly.
It sounds like the U.S. is having a tough time adapting to that new
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But, it's important to remember that there are lots of different perspectives within the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Not everyone agrees with this reverse Kissinger strategy.
Right.
There are plenty of people who think a more diplomatic, more cooperative approach is the way to go.
So there's kind of an internal debate going on in the U.S. about how to deal with the rest of the world.
Exactly. And how that debate plays out is going to have a big impact, not just on the U.S.,
Yeah.
but on the whole global order.
We talked earlier about how some European leaders are saying they want closer ties with China.
Yeah.
What's behind that?
Well, the EU is in a tricky spot, right? They're getting pressure from the U.S. to be tough on Russia and China. But they also have their own economic interests, their own strategic goals to think about.
Yeah.
China is a big trading partner for the EU.
Right.
And a lot of European countries see opportunities to cooperate with China on things like climate change and technology.
So they're trying to balance their relationship with the U.S. with their own interests.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
And this reverse Kissinger strategy just makes it even more complicated.
Right.
Some people are worried that it could actually create a rift between the U.S. and its European allies.
Wow. So instead of dividing Russia and China, the U.S. might end up splitting from Europe.
It's a possibility.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
The Trump administration's reverse Kissinger strategy, what could happen if it doesn't work, and this idea of a more cooperative way of handling international relations.
Right.
For you, what's the biggest takeaway from all this?
I think for me, it's how important it is to see the world as it really is, not how we want it to be. The world has changed a lot since the Cold War.
Yeah.
And if we keep clinging to these old ideas and strategies, it's going to lead to problems.
So you're saying we need to adapt to this new reality, this multipolar world.
Exactly.
But how do we actually do that? What does a more cooperative approach actually look like, practically?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it starts with moving away from this idea that everything is a zero-sum game.
Right.
Where if someone else wins, we automatically lose.
Right.
We have to recognize that we're all in this together and find ways to deal with these big challenges like climate change, global inequality. And we have to do it through dialogue and cooperation.
So instead of seeing China's rise as a threat,
Yeah.
the U.S. should try to find common ground and areas where they can work together.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that China is gaining economic and political influence. That's just a reality.
Right.
And trying to contain China or isolate them, it's probably just going to backfire.
So from what you're saying, it sounds like this reverse Kissinger strategy is a pretty big gamble.
Yeah.
That could really blow up in their faces.
There's definitely that risk.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, it could push Russia and China even closer, alienate U.S. allies,
Right.
and in the end, make the U.S. a lot weaker on the world stage.
And all this is happening at a time when we've got this global pandemic, climate change, all these other urgent problems that need countries to work together.
Yeah.
It seems like the U.S. is taking a big risk when the world really needs to be more united, not less.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? We need global cooperation more than ever,
Right.
but the U.S. is doing something that could actually divide the world even more.
We've talked about what might happen if the reverse Kissinger strategy fails. But what if? What if it actually works?
Okay.
What would that mean for the U.S. and for the world?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
If the U.S. did manage to pull Russia away from China, it would be a huge win for them geopolitically, no question.
Right.
They would have a lot more leverage in their dealings with both countries, probably get better trade deals, more cooperation on security issues,
Yeah.
and they could probably reassert themselves as the top dog on the world stage.
But wouldn't that just, make those same power dynamics even worse, the ones that are causing all the problems in the first place?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Even if it worked in the short term, it's not a long-term solution.
Right.
In the end, the world needs to move past this whole idea of power politics and find a way to govern itself that's more cooperative and benefits everyone.
So even if the U.S. got what it wanted right now, it wouldn't really solve anything in the long run.
Exactly. The real challenge isn't about winning or losing. It's about creating a global order that's fair, sustainable, and works for everyone.
Which brings us back to this idea of a multipolar world.
Right.
What are some of the defining features of a multipolar world, and how is it different from the system we have now?
In a multipolar world, you have multiple centers of power, and power is distributed more evenly.
Okay.
This means no single country or group of countries can just call all the shots.
Hmm.
It's a world where you have to cooperate and negotiate to solve problems.
We move away from this one superpower running everything.
Exactly. It's more decentralized, more fluid.
Yeah.
Power is constantly shifting and changing.
That sounds pretty complicated and unpredictable.
It can be, yeah. But it also creates all sorts of possibilities for new partnerships and alliances.
This all seems very theoretical, though.
Yeah.
Can you give me like a concrete example of what a multipolar world might actually look like?
Sure. Imagine the US, China, and the EU working together to tackle climate change.
Okay.
They're sharing technology, coordinating their policies, investing in renewable energy.
Right.
And at the same time, you have regional powers like India, Brazil, South Africa playing a bigger role in making global decisions.
So power is shared and decisions are made collaboratively based on consensus.
Exactly. Countries are working together to solve common problems instead of fighting each other for dominance.
This makes me wonder, how does China's ambitions fit into this multipolar world idea?
Right.
Some people say that China is just trying to replace the U.S. as the dominant global power.
Yeah, that's a common criticism.
Yeah.
But China says that their vision of multipolarity isn't about one hegemon replacing another. They want a system that's more inclusive, more equitable, where every country has a say.
So their goal isn't to create a world order led by China. It's to create a system that's more balanced and multipolar.
That's the message they're putting out there, yeah.
Right.
Of course, whether they'll actually follow through on that is another question.
That's a good point. We can't just take their word for it. We have to look at what they're actually doing on the world stage.
Exactly. We have to be critical and look at their actions, not just their words.
Okay, so where does Russia fit into all of this? It seems like they're getting closer to China, but what are their long-term goals?
Russia's in a really interesting position. They're a major military power with a huge territory and tons of natural resources.
Right.
But their economy isn't that strong, and they've been getting more and more isolated by the West.
Yeah.
Partnering with China gives them a way to push back against U.S. influence and protect their economic interests.
So they're using this relationship with China to strengthen themselves.
Exactly, and they're also playing a key role in shaping this emerging multipolar world.
We've talked a lot about the political and economic side of things, but what about the human side?
Mm-hmm.
How are ordinary people in these countries being affected by all these geopolitical moves?
That's a really important question that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
For people in Ukraine, for example, this war has been devastating. Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, and their economy is in ruins.
And what about people in Russia and China? How are they experiencing all these global shifts?
Well, in Russia, the war has meant more economic hardship and political repression. The government is cracking down on dissent, and a lot of Russians are feeling the pain of Western sanctions.
And in China?
China's economy has been slowing down, and the government's facing a lot of challenges.
Right.
Social unrest, environmental problems, and this rivalry with the U.S. just adds another layer of complexity.
It's a reminder that these geopolitical struggles aren't just abstract ideas. They have real consequences for the
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the high-level politics.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the people whose lives are being affected by these decisions.
We've covered a lot of different angles here. The reverse Kissinger strategy, what could happen if it backfires, the idea of a multipolar world, and how all this is impacting people on the ground.
Right.
But there's one big question we haven't really answered yet. What does all this mean for the young person listening?
That's a great question to think about. Why should anyone care about all these complicated geopolitical things happening on the other side of the world?
Yeah, how does this all connect to our everyday lives?
Well, these global power dynamics actually affect everyone. They influence the global economy, which affects things like jobs, prices, the things we buy.
Right.
They impact global security, which is connected to peace and stability around the world. And they shape how we deal with global challenges like climate change and pandemics.
So whether we realize it or not, these shifts in global power are shaping the world we live in.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to stay informed and get involved in these conversations.
Yeah.
The choices our leaders make have a direct impact on our lives, and we have to hold them accountable.
Yeah, it's crazy how much all this stuff impacts us,
It really is. Like, you might not think about it every day, but these big global power plays, they have a real ripple effect.
It's true. Like, we might feel removed from it all, but it does trickle down and touch our lives.
We're sure. I mean, think about something as simple as like how much you pay for gas.
Right.
That's connected to global energy markets, which are totally shaped by the relationships between countries, especially big players like the US, Russia, China.
Oh, yeah, that's a great example. Or even, like, how stable our investments are.
Exactly.
Global economic trends are definitely influenced by all this geopolitical stuff. And those trends, well, they hit our wallets directly.
It's all connected. And it's not just about the money either. Think about security. The whole rise of global terrorism, the fact that more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons. These are things that make everyone feel less safe. And they're directly related to who has the power in the world.
So we keep talking about the risks of this reverse Kissinger strategy.
Yeah.
But, let's say for a second it actually works. Could there be any upside for the U.S.?
Well, yeah, hypothetically, if they pull it off and actually get Russia and China to split, the U.S. would have way more bargaining power with both countries.
Okay.
They could probably swing some sweeter trade deals, get more cooperation on, like, security stuff, and generally be in a stronger position globally.
But wouldn't that just, reinforce the whole power struggle thing that's causing all these problems in the first place?
Yeah, that's the tough part. Even if it works out for the U.S. in the short run, it's not really fixing the bigger issues.
Yeah.
It's not making the world more stable or fair.
So it's kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
Exactly.
A temporary fix, not a real solution.
From everything we've been talking about, it seems like the real answer is to move towards a more cooperative way of, running the world.
But how do we actually do that? I mean, that seems like a huge, almost impossible undertaking.
Oh, it's definitely not easy. But I think the first step is to understand that the world is completely interconnected. All these problems we're facing, climate change, pandemics, the economy, these are global issues. We can't solve them if we don't work together.
So we need to ditch this whole us versus them mindset.
Right. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. It's about building trust, having real conversations, and finding things we agree on. Cooperation, not competition. That's what's going to create a better future for everyone.
That's a great point. So it's about moving past these old ways of thinking, this power struggle mentality, and building a new era of global cooperation.
It's a vision worth fighting for, even if it's a long and difficult road to get there.
This has been a really amazing deep dive. I feel like I understand these global forces so much better now.
Me too. It's always a learning process. The world never stands still, so we have to keep learning and adapting.
Well, before we wrap up, any last words of wisdom for our listeners as they try to navigate this increasingly complex world?
I would just say, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. The world is changing fast, and we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. To everyone listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.